Great to have you back again, ladies and gentlemen, in U.S. history. And during this lesson, we're going to be talking a little bit about the civil rights movement. And we are creeping towards the modern day, and certainly one of the more critical domestic issues, domestic, remember, being inside the U.S.'s borders, that we've dealt with over the last 50 years has been the civil rights movement. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, how that came to be, what it looked like, who were the players, and things of that sort. And as before, this is going to be part one of two, so we'll have part A and part B for this particular lesson. So let's take a look and see what we've got going. Well, the civil rights movement is really based on the idea that not all Americans had equal rights, that certainly white men contained the most power in the United States social structure after World War II and prior to World War II and pretty much through the whole show. And that if you were a person of color or a woman, and women's rights is something that we'll deal with outside of this particular discussion, you didn't have the same rights that white men did. And so the civil rights movement was an effort to try to rectify that. It was done legally through the legal system. It was done politically through the voting system, and it was also done with force. So we'll take a look at all those things. But what's the origins of the movement? Well, certainly after the Civil War, we had Reconstruction. And Reconstruction was, at least the attempt was, to try to pull the country back together utilizing the new rules set forth in the Constitution that provided everyone with equal rights. But as we saw before, that didn't happen. And what it led to were these laws, especially in the South, called Jim Crow laws, which still held down especially African American people to a different standard. They did not have the same rights that whites did. There was a landmark, critical Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson in 1986, which upheld the idea of separate but equal. And it essentially said that as long as the facilities were equal, you could separate people. It legalized segregation and separation. And we know that certainly the facilities, schools, civil organizations, things of that sort, were not equal for blacks and whites. To come along to deal with that was the NAACP, and we talked about that, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, to try to help with that. And then ultimately what pushed it to the forefront after World War II was the idea that African Americans had fought and died for their country, and that they should be given those equal rights. So the civil rights movement really began in earnest. Certainly people had been pushing for civil rights for decades, but really began in earnest after World War II. And it was that double V that we just talked about, the idea that we wanted victory overseas, and we also wanted victory from segregation at home. And people began thinking a little bit about the idea that if black men especially, and black women too, were going to fight for their country and die, how on earth could we then hold them to a different standard here? It was an equity, a fairness issue that a lot of people allowed this to bring it to the fore. Another civil rights bill passed, a really important one called Brown versus Board of Education. It passed out of Kansas in 1954, and it essentially overturned that Plessy versus Ferguson. It said, no, you can't separate people. You can't separate people in terms of education. And this was a huge, huge issue. And essentially it was started while Linda Brown, who was a student, was not allowed to attend an all-white school. And the Supreme Court ruled that that was unconstitutional. So schools were required to integrate blacks and whites in the same school building. That had never happened before, especially in the South, and caused a huge amount of upheaval. So what did the South do about this? Well, the South essentially created something called the Southern Manifesto, and essentially pledged to fight the Brown decision, pledged not to integrate their schools. However, some school districts complied with that decision. Others refused. In Virginia, entire public school districts closed and opened as private districts so they could refuse to admit African Americans. A lot of different things happened. One of the problems with the bill was that the Supreme Court required the districts to integrate their schools with blacks and whites with deliberate speed, and that was too vague to enforce. So a lot of people said, well, we're moving towards segregation, but they were certainly dragging their heels. Another main issue that kind of started and jump-started the whole process of civil rights was Rosa Parks and the bus boycott. And this was in December of 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama. Rosa Parks was a worker. She was tired at the end of her shift, got onto a bus in Montgomery, sat down in the whites-only section, and refused to get up and move to the back of the bus when a white patron came on and asked her to. And so she was arrested for failing to give up her front seat. And this was a wonderful case to galvanize around, arresting this nice woman for doing nothing other than sitting in a seat. And it made people really think about what were we doing here related to segregation. So it was supported by African Americans and ultimately organized by a new player on the scene, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And the bus boycott itself essentially said that African Americans weren't going to ride Montgomery buses. So it lasted 381 days, so over a year. And what it ultimately led to was the Supreme Court, again, coming up with another decision that said that segregation on public transportation was illegal. So in 1956, the Supreme Court, again, like they had in Brown versus Board of Education, affirmed that segregation was illegal. And it really started this civil rights movement, as I talked about, and introduced America to Martin Luther King Jr. So let's talk a little bit about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. a little bit. He certainly drew his teachings from that of Gandhi. He was a reverend, obviously, and he felt that Mahatma Gandhi in India had the right idea in terms of peaceful means to bring about change. So he was not about being a warrior in the violent sense, but a warrior in terms of nonviolence. He founded something called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and that was what galvanized black leaders in the South to trying to make some changes. And ultimately he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 for his nonviolent leadership. Another place where we see everything coming to head, and it really focused on education again, was in Little Rock, Arkansas, with something called the Little Rock Crisis. And 9 African American students in Little Rock were not admitted to the all-white Central High School. This is after the Brown versus Board of Education that said they had to be. And the governor of Arkansas at that time, Orville Favis, essentially brought out the National Guard to prevent students from entering. He ultimately pulled them back when the President of the United States said you can't use the National Guard for these kind of purposes, these illegal purposes. But an angry mob of people in Little Rock were essentially threatening the students who were trying to go to school, the 9 African American students. And so President Eisenhower, in one of his very few things that he did related to civil rights, sent in the paratroopers and federalized or made the National Guard in Arkansas essentially federal troops so the students could enter safely. And that became another rallying point in terms of civil rights.